Hello there, I'm Mariette DiCristina, the Dean of the Boston University College of Communication. I'm also an alum of COM and the parent of a recent BU grad. Welcome to this afternoon's COM Talks event, reporting on rock when rock is dead. Rock lags behind pop, hip hop, and other genres in today's music scene. So what's left over to cover for music journalists and marketers? Plenty, as you'll hear today from a panel of expert COM alums. And when you have questions, and I hope you do, please put them in the Q&A on the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. And please feel free to put those questions in at any time. There'll be plenty of time to discuss them later during the event, I promise. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. First, let's say hello to Joe Steinhardt, who is the owner and co-founder of Don Giovanni Records, the Philadelphia-based label that helped launch the careers of Waxahachie, Screaming Females, Mitski, Laura Stevenson, and More Mother, among other critically acclaimed indie acts. In 2016, Joe founded the New Alternative Music Festival, a 2-day concert at Asbury Park featuring musicians outside of major labels or corporate distribution. He's a 2006 COM grad and earned a PhD in communication at Cornell. He currently resides in Philadelphia, where he's an assistant professor at Drexel University's music industry program. Hi there, Joe.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's awesome to have you here. Now let's say hello to Michael Grecco, who's an award-winning director and photographer of celebrity portraits, advertising and editorial commissions, private collections, and fine art. Michael has created advertising and editorial commissions, Michael has created iconic portraits of the most recognized entertainment stars such as Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Will Ferrell, and Penelope Cruz. He's the author of the guidebook, Lightning and the Dramatic Portrait, The Art of Celebrity and Editorial Photography, and most recently, author of Punk, Post-Punk, New Wave, On Stage, Backstage, In Your Face, 1977 to 1989, which chronicles his years taking photos of 80s era musicians during shows in Boston and New York. Michael is a COM grad and lives in Los Angeles. Hey there, Michael. So glad you're here. Now, let's say hello to Victoria Wasylak, who's an award-winning journalist, music critic, and editor for the music website Vanyaland. Her hundreds of articles for Vanyaland include interviews with such diverse artists as Lizzo, Shirley Manson, Peter Wolf, and Carrie Brownstein. Victoria also helps edit Disgraceland, the world's #1 most downloaded music podcast. She was named Music Journalist of the Year at the Boston Music Awards and recently became a professional member of the Recording Academy and a board member of the Boston chapter of Women in Music. Victoria graduated from COM in 2017 and lives just north of Boston. Hi there, Victoria.
Hello, delighted to be here.
So happy you're here. Now let's pass it over to our moderator, William McKeen, who is chair of the Department of Journalism here at COM and editor of the anthology Rock and Roll is Here to Stay. Bill is the author of 8 books and the editor of 4 more. And before beginning his teaching career, he worked for several newspapers and magazines. His teaching areas include literary journalism, history of journalism, and history of rock and roll. Over to you there, Bill, and thanks a million.
All right, thank you. And thanks to all of the guests for taking the time. You know, I thought I'd start by asking a question about categories and about what we're doing and all of that. And when I was putting together this mammoth tome years ago, the book she just mentioned, we had no idea what to call it. And eventually my editor called me up and said, I'm naming it Rock and Roll is Here to Stay. And I said, oh, please don't. Because I was afraid that when I was out flogging the book on book tour, that the first question from any interviewer would be, is rock and roll actually here to stay? And I just didn't want to deal with that question. Maybe I didn't want to face the answer myself. But the fact is, nobody asked that question. I do love that term though, rock and roll. And I want to start off talking about music labels and categorization. I think the reason I love that word is because I'm an idealist, and it represents to me that one of the high points in American history. You know, during the years of segregation in the United States, laws could allow communities to have separate schools and regulate who sat where in the drugstore and who sat where in the movie theater. But the one thing that did not have to bend to Jim Crow laws was the air, and radio traveled through the air. And I really think of that time as the time when Black America and white America met. And I like rock and roll as the name for that music that was the hybrid form, because it speaks to two things that have been kept separate, now put together, make something different and better. So that was rock and roll, but that was also a good metaphor for society. So my question is rock and roll in fact here to stay? Or why do we have labels at all? Should we have labels? When we think about charts, does that mean anything anymore? I mean, the rules have all changed so fast in the last few years. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start with Victoria with that question. You know, you have impressive work. I don't remember if the dean mentioned your work on Disgraceland, but you know, one of the best podcasts about music. Do labels matter anymore? Should we have labels on music?
Well, that's largely going to depend on who you ask, but I cannot tell you how many bands and artists I talked to today who say we prefer not to use a genre because we're more than just rock, or we're more than just folk, we're more than just pop. I get that absolutely all the time. Personally, I still need them for my job to somewhat guide people into what they're listening to, what they're about to hear when they read an article, and there's an embed code at the bottom. But because of the internet, I think we have this huge melting pot. I mean, there have been so many think pieces written about the fact that genres don't mean what they used to, because things are so malleable, things are so flexible. And I often joke that as a music journalist, it is my solemn duty to invent subgenres and then use them in articles as if they are a well-established thing. But I think with rock in particular, when people think of rock and roll, they think of hard rock, and they don't see the hard rock that they grew up with on the charts anymore. So they think, well, it must not exist. That could not be farther from the truth. The rock that we have now, it is a little bit more poppy, more dancey. That's what's popular, but it's very much out there. And we have the internet, Spotify, every streaming service, YouTube, to make sure that it still gets to people. But I think it's a very interesting question about labels, because especially when you mentioned charts, Lil Nas X not being considered for country because they thought Old Town Road was too much of a hip hop song and it wasn't country. These are very modern problems. And because they're so modern, we don't necessarily have a solution to them yet. Similar example, Casey Musgrave's new album, as it stands right now, cannot be considered for country Grammy categories because it's too poppy. Although most people would argue tooth and nail, she is a country artist. So this is something we're still kind of figuring out as we go. But the shortest answer I can say is what I said before. Genres certainly don't mean what they used to, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Thank you. That's good. Joe or Michael, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I thought that was really well thought out. I mean, I guess it was interesting being invited to this, and I have a lot of thoughts on music, but talking about like rock and genre, I guess I've always sort of thought that once you bring an album into your house, the genre is completely meaningless, right? It's really kind of a function for sorting things out in stores and marketing and in journalism, which can be sometimes even part of that like marketing and discovery process. But like, it's obviously like a constructed thing, as is, I guess, music itself. But I mean, it's just kind of it doesn't really. I'm not sure how much it really matters in a lot of contexts. So I understand that Victoria has to use it at work, and if you work in a record store, you have to use it. But as a listener, it's something I've never really thought about too much. But statistically, rock is, I don't understand the notion of rock being dead statistically. Last year, 44% of all physical albums sold were rock, and 30% of all digital albums sold were rock. And if you lump the next three genres together, pop, R&B, and hip hop, you get only 22% of physical and about 27% of digital albums. So what we're really just seeing is like a move into streaming, which is much more like single driven, like the old model of music. But when it comes to albums, it just seems weird to say that rock is dead, I guess. I don't know. Sorry, I just answered a bunch of different questions.
No, that's great. Michael, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that because of the environment we're in now with streaming and so much music available on the internet, you sort of, music gets lost very easily, and rock can get lost very easily because there's no one source for music in general. I mean, you know, the book, my book, Punk, Post-Punk, New Wave, On Stage, Backstage, In Your Face, what I was saying earlier was that's got to be the longest book title ever created. That was the publisher's suggestion. I think that, you know, from that period on, you know, you can lump all of punk, post-punk, new wave together, but you had to categorize it as rebellious and authentic and angry and trying to break the mold. And I think that's what we're missing. I think that that's what, there's a homogenous sense of a lot of music of what's coming out, that you've got bands like St. Vincent, who I absolutely love, can't be classified. It's, you know, it's not rock, it's not EDM, it's not, and I think it's harder to define and harder to find because of the sources. There's so many sources, and everything's sort of blended and mixed in together on YouTube or wherever you're going for your music.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, one person's country might be another person's rock and roll, you know, sounds a lot alike. I'm always interested in where people find music, and I think back to being a little kid, and I think in my generation, I would say less is more. You know, we had fewer choices, fewer ways to hear music, and I always like to tell the story about my cross-country move with my family when I was a kid in the summer of 1965, and I was in the car that had my mother and sister, and I was in the back seat, and we had 5 dogs in the car with us, 1 male and 4 females in heat. And I was in back in charge of the 4 females, and the male dog would sit up front with his head, and he'd look at the 4 females, and his teeth would chatter. And of course, what was the biggest song of the summer of 1965 that blasted from the radio every hour, but I Can't Get No Satisfaction. So this is how, you know, a lot of people have different feelings associated with that song. I just think about a horny poodle. But the reason I bring that up is that I remember that trip so vividly, because the radio station would play James Brown, and then the Beatles, and then Frank Sinatra, and then Diana Ross and the Supremes. And it was just complete anarchy. And I think it's because, as Victoria was saying about labels, they hadn't really decided on the labels yet. So when I think about that kind of blend, this great mixture of music, I wonder, how do you find that today when we have so many more choices, and they are, you know, so directed as, you know, this stream here is for hip hop fans who part their hair on the right, and this is for hip hop fans who part their hair on the left. Do we have a common marketplace anymore? Because it, you know, to me, radio was always key to this. The DJ was sort of the arbiter, or he was like, I don't mean this in a bad way, but the DJ could serve as a gateway drug to certain music he or she would share with us. There was that sense of community. Do we have that anymore?
I think that's what
rambling.
I think that's what my book deals with, is this period of time where what you got was curated, and it was curated in a manner that was up to the record company and the DJ, and whether the DJ was getting payola and cocaine or however you got a record on the air at the time. And now what you have is total democracy, right? You have, pretty close to total democracy, but in some ways, I don't know if that's better or not, because that curation was useful. And there are curated sources, but there are just so many sources that it's hard. It's no longer a curated world.
It puts a lot more pressure on the word of mouth way, and maybe after Victoria, maybe Joe would want to say something about that from the angle of being a label owner. Victoria, you were about to speak, I think.
Yeah, just talking about all the sources of music brings up something I think is relevant to the topic about rock being dead. I've heard over and over again people say, oh, they don't make them like they used to. People do not see quote unquote icons the way that they used to. And I think there's one really easy explanation for that, is that because compared to 20 years ago, we have exposure to so many more artists, which is wonderful. However, I as a listener have the same amount of money and I have the same amount of time and attention. So instead of that getting split 5 ways, that's getting split 10, 15, 20 ways. So people aren't able to accumulate the amount of money and notoriety that they used to. In fact, it's almost like it's getting split. It's the same amount of money and time from everybody, but it's getting split more ways. And I think that's a huge reason why we're not seeing the icons that people seem to miss. They don't see a Tom Petty. They don't see a Prince. Well, the Tom Pettys and the Princes of the world are still out there. It's just that it's getting split more ways because we just have so much more exposure. We don't have to rely on the radio to hear new music, or if we're really dedicated going into a record store and getting our fingers dirty and dusty, finding something new. We can literally just hop online and see what our friends like, look at their playlists, things like that. So that's definitely not the sole reason, but I think that's a huge reason that people tend to overlook.
Joe?
Yeah, so I don't want to be combative, but I definitely not agreeing with some of these premises. Like I think if you look, we're in a world that is much more consolidated than ever, not less. And I think we might have a greater illusion of choice as music consumers, but it's much more consolidated both on radio and as far as what our options are for streaming platforms and where people are listening to music. It's less places, and then those places have even smaller number of gatekeepers than they had in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. And we're heading for even more rapid consolidation. So I mean, this has less to do with the genre at this point, but I do just think it's just a false premise to sort of say that things were like music was sort of less tightly controlled, or is less tightly controlled now that there's like more things out there. Because I think as a listener, I see it as the opposite. I guess I also want to respond to what Victoria said about, I think they do make them like they used to. It's just that they don't hold guitars, right? Like for every Tom Petty, there's Ariana Grande, there's Dua Lipa, right? There's massive pop icons, it's true. They're not playing rock right now, but I think this gets back to this idea of looking at music and culture through institutions and power. That's just what's kind of being pushed out there and what's working right now. And we easily might start seeing guitars again in 10 years in what's sort of being pushed by the major institutions. I know that sounds bleak. As a listener, there's ways to avoid it, but I think if you look at music and culture as a whole, it's always been this way. And I think it's actually getting worse and more tightly controlled.
There is a reliance on word of mouth, hearing from your friends what they're listening to. So I appreciate that. I always worry about serendipity, though. It seems like you kind of have to know what you're looking for when you don't know what you're looking for. Whereas serendipity is, of course, finding the stuff you didn't know you were looking for. So and that's something that you can't really duplicate. It's just it's in your head. So our gatekeepers, instead of being disc jockeys, they're friends who post playlists. How do you find music? I mean, I know you're probably have it come to it in a number of different ways. Joe.
I just want to respond to that before we talk about discovery. When you're talking about like word of mouth and how they're, again, that, but that's mediated by corporations, the word of mouth right now. And that's why it is actually funneled into the top small amount of things that can afford to buy the word of mouth eyeballs. And we see it in politics and we recognize it, but we don't want to recognize when it's happening in music and film and culture. That seems to feel like our friend told us stuff. But it's the same behind the scenes processes. And I worry a lot about it as a less as a label. Let's take that as a consumer, as a listener, and it's just someone that is interested in culture thriving. It's pretty scary. And it's why everywhere you go, you see these same 6 to 7 pop icons. They're at McDonald's now on the meals, and they're on Facebook as the top suggested thing, and they're on Twitter, and they're in the record store, and they're on, it's things are just much more consolidated. And there are, but I think we do have major icons. I just don't know if they're holding guitars right now. But I just want to be careful to think that because we have the ability to communicate with anyone around the world and the ability to listen to anyone, it's so heavily mediated by algorithms and by platforms. So it's not gatekeepers, it's mediated by platforms and algorithms, but it's so heavily mediated that actually what you find is less choice out there. And you find bad things rising to the top. And so it's this illusion that we have access to everything. I just want to be careful. We don't have to go down this trail today. I know we're talking about rock music, but I do feel like I feel like I need to say something about that if we're going to talk about this world where we have access to everything. We kind of don't as much as we want to believe we do.
I don't mind going down that trail because I'm just very curious about how we find our music. I mean, I'm kind of depressed a lot of the time thinking about, I want to hear new music. Where am I going to find it? And, I'll listen to some radio stations or whatever, and then I'll end up going back to some old music. To me, the serendipity with music hasn't quite been working out so well lately. But did anyone want to respond to my original question, which of course I've forgotten and can't rephrase, but it was about where you find music, I think.
I like to look at a source of authority. I'll look at the New York Times, the arts and leisure section, see who they're writing about. I mean, the nice thing is it's accessible, and you can go to Amazon and you can play clips of people, or YouTube, and play people and see what you like. And we were talking about this earlier. I actually tend to buy the CD and rip it Apple lossless for my home stereo system, and then put it on all my devices. And if I'm on an airplane on an assignment, I have my iPod, I have my phone, I have my iPad. So I still like buying the physical product, but I will go to a source of authority, a music writer that I like, or a tip of some sort. And I'm always going for the eclectic myself. I mean, one of my favorite, he was a friend of mine because he's did the music supervision of a documentary I did a while back. Nick Harcourt, who was out here, I'm in Santa Monica. He was here at KCRW, and Nick's a friend. There was a long-standing show here on the public radio station KCRW called The Morning Becomes Eclectic. And you would hear everything from fado music and Cesaria Evora to, I'm at a loss, Little Joy, or, eclectic bands. And that's what I tend to gravitate towards myself. And that's what I buy and support.
I'm glad you brought up public radio, because I don't think I've ever listened to an NPR review of an album and not gone out and bought the album. And as we were saying before, I really believe in tangible media. I believe I'm betraying the artist if I just download the music. I mean, I want all the information that goes with it. It's a great convenience to also have the download on my phone or whatever, because I can play it in my car. But there are certain sources we go to, and I think public radio spends a lot of time, takes the music criticism very seriously. Victoria, did you want to respond to that question?
Yes, I have the privilege of being bombarded over the head with hundreds of emails of new music every day. But aside from that, I should say, I find one of the best ways to find new music is to see who my favorite bands are playing with. Who are they going on tour with? Sometimes maybe I can't make it to the show to see them in person myself, but that's how I find a lot of bands I probably wouldn't have come across otherwise. Even, obviously we didn't have in real life shows for a while there, but people were doing live streams with similar artists to themselves, artists on the same label. That's another easy way. Go to a label like, oh, 2 or 3 of my favorite artists are on the same label. Well, I can almost promise you're going to find another 2 or 3 that you'll really like, because birds of a feather flock together. That would be my tip.
Okay.
My new tip would be to listen to Victoria's podcast.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was going to say that in addition to the word of mouth and the occasional somebody posting a link on Facebook or sending me a link for a song, I've realized that podcasts have driven me to the record store. I know I date myself by using that term, but podcasts have been very influential in helping me build my tastes. And back in the old days, when I was a record critic, I used to get about 60 free albums a day. That's a great reason to be a record critic. But does anyone want to respond to the sort of why be a record critic? What is the value of record criticism? Is it really dancing about architecture? I mean, it seems to me that the response to the music is going to weigh so much more heavily on the consumer than, oh, this guy said it was pretty good. What's the point of rock criticism? You're not.
I mean, for me, it's the lead, right? I'm not like Victoria or you. I don't get, CDs every day and downloads, and people aren't passing me music. It's the lead, right? It's the pointer that gets you to test it and listen to it.
Okay. Joe?
For me, I'm an avid reader, so I love reading everything. And I've been reading rock criticism my whole life, and I continue to, and it's really shaped a lot of, I don't know if it's shaped what I've listened to, but it shaped how I've thought about what I've listened to. I feel the same way with like film criticism. I usually don't read it until after I watch the movie. And lots of times I'll listen to a record and I really won't care for it, or I won't get it, and then I'll read criticism. Sometimes I still won't get it, but I'll appreciate it. Other times I'll totally get it. So it's funny because I don't know how much it actually factors in to my musical discovery, but it's just something that I just really have always enjoyed reading, and I think it's definitely I love reading good criticism. When it's just kind of like marketing, it usually can skip it. But like thoughtful criticism about music is just like reading thoughtful criticism about art or books or film or something. It's just a joy to read. I don't know how else to explain it.
Victoria?
I'm going to answer more as music journalism as a whole, if that's okay. But, when I was 17 and I decided that this is what I wanted to do, it was because I wanted to write, and I wanted to write about something that I already paid a lot of attention to. So that was music. But as I get deeper and deeper into my career, I realized the responsibility that I have to help these artists explain themselves and their backgrounds and where they're coming from. Interviewing them, and then being able to help present what's going on in the album. Sometimes it's just a fun album about, dancing and spilling drinks in the club, and there's nothing wrong with that. We all need some levity in our lives, but other times it's helping to explain their experiences with racism, with homophobia, as being a woman, things like that. And I think a lot of times someone might not give an album the time of day if they didn't know that was what's going on in the background. They might say, oh, I don't like that style of music, so I'm not even going to bother listening to it.
Mhm.
I would say, well, you could learn something about what it's like to be somebody that's not you, or find it relatable, and you'll end up loving a new style of music you didn't even think possible. So I really do see that as a responsibility that I have, because there are just so many instances of, if somebody didn't know what the album was truly about, if it's too poetic, or maybe they just didn't give it enough time, they wouldn't bother with the album. And so, that helps them. They get to hear new music. That helps the artists. They get to reach more people. And I think, especially when it comes to societal issues, now the listener knows more about what's going on in the world, and will be able to take that knowledge elsewhere when they see things going on in the news, or when a friend comes to them with, hey, I'm really frustrated with this problem because I'm getting treated differently because XYZ. So I think there's a huge, it really mushrooms. There's a huge effect of, me writing one piece about this hip hop album about Black Lives Matter. Not to sound self-important, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. I think music journalism and music criticism can do a lot to help us change lanes. And this is kind of a simplistic question, but I'd like to know what writer about music has affected you the most? Who is it that made you think this is what I want to do, or this is the kind of writer I'm going to continue to read if we're not practicing it? Who are the writers that you think have had the greatest influence, Joe?
Well, I want to go back. I'm sorry. I feel like I should always answer the last question when you ask the next one. It takes me like 40 minutes to think about an answer, and I have a much better answer. I have a much more, after hearing Victoria talk, just had something I think is really worth saying about music writing. Is that okay?
Well,
And then I think at the end of the day, what we really, I was realizing more thoughtfully why I like reading this stuff so much, about art and anything. And it's like, what we really like about music is narratives. I don't really, and that's true with most art, right? Like, I could play you a record and you could think nothing of it. And then I could tell you that it was recorded underground 100 miles in a cave by a man with one arm named Michelangelo. And you would say, yeah, this is a great record. And what we and I have research on this actually, but what we appreciate about art is narratives. When you look at lines on paper, it might not mean anything, and then you put text on paper, and then you learn about the person who put those lines on the paper and what their life is, and and all of a sudden it's a whole new thing. And so I think to imply anything else implies there's some objective weight to art and music, and there's just not. And so I think maybe that's why I like reading so much criticism and biography and stuff, is because I think that's like what we like about, that's what we actually like about music. If not, like, if you take the best music and the worst music, it's much closer, I think, than you think it is. And it's actually just these narratives and things like that around it. So sorry, I'll be ready to answer this next question.
I'll always come back to
20
you.
minutes.
Okay. So you don't want to answer the question now about the writer that you found most influential?
Oh, I can. It's probably this person, Ivor Robbins. He wrote this Trouser Press guide, and I it's not like he's the greatest writer of all time. He's just someone that I found when I was very young, and it's like his writing's actually pretty dry, but he was very descriptive. Same with this person, Paul Major, who would write about these very obscure records and just very descriptive, just like, this is what this is. But it was just like people like that when I was younger, just really, really informed me. Now there's so many different people that I read. But it's like when I was younger, like Ivor Robbins, it's probably the person I can think of.
For me, it was someone who stuck in my head, very early on. As a kid growing up in New York, I was into jazz, and I would start reading Bob Blumenthal's liner notes on every record, and then sought out his jazz criticism. And when I moved to Boston and started shooting, I had the honor of shooting his column for the Boston Phoenix in the early 80s. And he got me to understand a genre that's very complex and can be sophisticated, and have many different many different aspects to it, from someone like Bix Beiderbecke to Ornette Coleman and the art ensemble of Chicago. So he really, he was, I guess just because he was the first for me, he was sort of the most influential.
Victoria?
I guess I have a little bit of an unconventional answer. When I was younger, when we have a dream, we look for ourselves for real examples in real life, right? Like, who is like me, who is doing what I want to do with my life. And I didn't see me when I was younger. I remember I subscribed to Rolling Stone just because I wanted to be a music journalist, and I was like, well, gotta read up, gotta read the Bible, so to speak. And I distinctly remember looking through it, and one day, and there were only 2 women's names in it as far as writing goes, and they were both tiny blurbs. And I remember how not great that felt. So I guess to answer your question, I do enjoy the work of Jessica Hopper, but there is no one particular person that made me say, oh, I want to emulate that. I want to be like them. I just wanted to do it. And unfortunately, I mean, it's come a long way in the short amount of time that I've been in music journalism with regards to more women entering the field, but there's still a long way to go. Because I'll tell you, that afternoon when I only saw those 2 little blurbs, that was 2014. That's not that long ago.
Yeah, we don't want to talk too much about Rolling Stone in that regard, because it's not a good track record. The only way a woman could get on the staff there was to start as a secretary, and several of them may have ended up eventually being managing editors or something. But you're right. It was a boys' club.
I mean, that's funny. I'd like to add something though, because the photography department there has always been women. From Lori Kretokville to the present, it's always been run by women. So it's there's this there is a dichotomy there, in that regard. Victoria, do you feel like being a woman gives you more access? There's a openness to having you hang out, be backstage, have access, have people have a willingness to speak to you?
No, I'm
Yes.
just like anybody else.
As the resident geezer on the panel, I can say that as a high school kid, I was really influenced by the critics in the first wave at Rolling Stone. In particular, a guy who no longer writes criticism named John Landau went on to become Bruce Springsteen's manager. I thought he was a wonderful critic because he would get so emotional in writing about music. And, also Lester Bangs, who I think everybody seems to like for one reason or another. I'd like to read a couple of questions that we got in the Q&A down below, and then I have some lightning round questions that I can throw in at the end, and you may want to seize the microphone and pontificate also. But let's start with a couple of questions. I will read this one from Robert Spector, who's got a twofer for us. 2 questions. What rock is selling streaming? Is it ? Pre or post 1980? And the second question, to the points on genre classification, doesn't Spotify eliminate this? The algos give you suggestions based on actual listening bits, not on which section of the record store you browsed. All right. Anyone want to take that one? What's selling or streaming? What rock is? There's a bunch of people like me listening to Tom Petty or what?
I will say that box sets tend to sell exceptionally well. You see this at Record Store Day every single year, is that someone like you saying Tom Petty just now reminded me of that. Someone like Tom Petty, Bruce Springsteen, etc., will release a $200 box set with God knows how much re-released stuff in it, and that will sell exceptionally well. I've seen lots of articles reporting on how that makes a huge chunk of record sale revenue every year. In regards to what rock is selling, I mean, the band that comes to mind, the biggest rock band that you consistently see on the top of the charts and things like that is Imagine Dragons. I've seen people get into arguments over whether or not they are a rock band, which we don't have to get into. But things like that, I kind of like what I said earlier. There's a very much an element of, you could play it at a party and it would be very enjoyable. It's dancey, it's light, it's fun. At least that's what you're going to see, on the Billboard 100.
Okay. How about the Spotify question? Does it eliminate the genre classification? And is that a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, you were saying earlier you thought it was a good guide to help people find music. Does anyone want to respond to that one?
I will, but I think I was saying it was a terrible guide to help people find music, because I think it guides people into a very tight window of a few artists. I think certainly genre, to say genre can be eliminated, I don't exactly understand. I think we're getting playlists that are incredibly genre. Some of those popular playlists are genre focused, and yeah, they might be micro genre, like late night chill or something like that. But that's a genre. I don't know what that is besides a genre. Unless you only go in and listen to your Discover Weekly or something like that, in which case you never need a genre in the first place. And so I think I don't know. There's a lot of reasons that if you really want to discover music, I would try not to stream. And there's even more reasons for the environment and sustainability reasons I would urge you not to stream. But I don't really see how I see genre as being like irrelevant to that art, to either of those arguments, because either you don't need it or you do, and if you do, it's still there.
I had high hopes for streaming services like Pandora, and I would not put in a genre, but I can type in Thievery Corporation, and the hope was that I would hear a wide variety of things that are similar. But the reality is, if you listen to it long enough, it is a very tight window. It's what has been accepted to play, as opposed to new artists or things that, it's like I see Joe's point that getting airplay even on something like Pandora is difficult.
If I went to the record store in 1998 or 88 or 78, and I started just asking for, I brought in, I don't know, Aerosmith or something like that, whatever record was popular in 1996, Get a Grip. And I said, I've got this record, give me some recommendations. And I could go in every day, and maybe I'd get to Fugazi or something, I don't know. I would go down this trail, but where I would never, ever end up, ever, at the independent record store, that is, I would never, ever end up at the biggest pop records of the day. The person would never tell me to buy it. And if I started reading fanzines, I would never end up getting to the biggest pop records of the day. Streaming, if you leave it going for not very long, you quickly end up at the biggest pop records of the day. And that's just where it's funneling you. And this is not good or bad. A lot of it's great. I don't think there is good and bad music. I don't even want to get into that. It's about where this music's coming from and the consolidation of power and the institutions. I'm not going to tell you these records are good or bad, but you have much fewer choices, and you're getting funneled into much less places. And I think it's hard to argue otherwise. And I think it's sort of scary that journalism now seems to be following suit, being driven more by Twitter and social media numbers. And so they're also now only covering the biggest records of the day. And they're giving more space to less artists, and less records when they didn't used to. Again, I could have read every single issue of Maximum Rock and Roll, and I would just have never encountered an article about Bruce Springsteen or someone like that. And quickly now, if you look at underground, blog publications, they're talking about Taylor Swift, they're talking about Kanye West, they're talking about Ken Lamar. These are all great artists, but there's no spaces where they aren't anymore. And that's a major, I think that's a much bigger problem than people want to talk about, that there's no spaces that they aren't, because then it becomes, what's wrong with Taylor Swift, and she's fantastic, but there needs to be spaces that there aren't, that she's not.
I think you make a good argument for the record store, right? The music store. I mean, I remember in 1980 going to Newberry Comics when there was one Newberry Comics on Newberry Street, and either Greg Riebman, the DJ, or Mike Derice, you'd ask them, "What should I get?" You know, and in some of those, "What should I get?" is the very first, you know, import album of U2 and the very first import album of The Cure and Bauhaus, and, you know, in that era of what I was into. But they were not things being played on the radio at that point. And they were almost the music critic, right? They were the music critic. They were the people, you know, even an employee who wasn't a DJ knew what was unusual and interesting, and you would find bands like the Mekons and things that weren't being written about.
Yeah, but you also didn't go to buy, you know, Depeche Mode or something in the 80s, and they'd say, you know, you should also get the new Elton John because it's also one of the biggest. It's also it's the biggest record going right now. So, you know, there wasn't that level, and that's actually what these. I think people give way too much credit. I think the further you get in the music industry and the more you see what these algorithms are, they're not very sophisticated. And they're quite usually just a person that they want you to think they're sophisticated algorithms, but it's actually just usually a person clicking stuff, a human being. They don't have AI.
Well, the motivation of an employee at a record store was to give you something interesting and to show what great taste they had, right? It wasn't that they're one in a billion websites that are trying to get traffic, which is the problem now.
That was kind of the role of serendipity too, was stepping into the music, the record store and oh, what's that? What are you playing? And we need to keep moving because we're getting a lot of questions, and believe it or not, we're running out of time. So I've got a question here from Dan Shapiro. It says, as a music writer, what responsibility do you feel you have towards steering your readers/listeners to the most artist-friendly digital point of sale? Gearing listeners toward record stores, Bandcamp, and artist websites is much more artist-friendly compared to Spotify. There's your arbiter right there, with the CEO having more money than Paul McCartney and Elton John, and of artists can have a bigger share. There's a more chance for bands to keep making records. I think the last part's just commentary, but does the music writer, critic, or feature writer, whatever, do you have a responsibility to steer your readers toward some more satisfying economic experience?
Well, it's definitely a courtesy to link to pre-order or order the album in some kind of physical form, if assuming it exists. There are a lot of people who only do digital releases. But my main answer, probably you won't like, but something I learned at Com over and over and over again, is that as a journalist, you write for the readers. I'm not writing for the artists at the end of the day. It makes my heart happy that it does actually inadvertently help them, because, you know, more people are learning about them and their experiences and hopefully buying some albums. But at the end of the day, I am working for the readers. And the biggest common denominator for listening to music in 2021 is Spotify. So I frequently, almost always, use Spotify at the bottom, although a lot of times you can see, even without asking an artist, based on what they share on social media, you can kind of see what their preference is. Some people want you to go towards Spotify because it's going to make their streams go up, which will maybe get them on some playlists, which will open up more doors. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, buying the album is always the best way. I still buy albums, you know, whereas other people might say, please go to Bandcamp and buy our new record. In that case, you know, I might drop the Bandcamp link in. There are other ways to express this courtesy, like reminding people that it's Bandcamp Friday now. And here are some of the great albums that are coming out today on Bandcamp Friday, which, if you're unfamiliar, this launched last year during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the first Friday of every month, I believe, Bandcamp completely waives their portion that they would take, the fee for putting your music on their website. Nice. Okay. So reminding people about that and saying, hey, look what's coming out today. But again, and I recognize that a lot of people will probably not like that answer, but strictly speaking, as a journalist, you have to put in what the most people will be able to access, kind of in the way that maybe not when you get into really heady criticism, but in the same way that we write at a 4th or 5th grade reading level. We write it so the most people can access it. I think there is a balance at play.
I'm very fond of your answer. Thank you. Moving on, Bert Levine has a question just for you, Joe. What do you think of the resurgence of vinyl? Also, do you think it has better sound than digital music?
I think the resurgence of vinyl is interesting, and I use it a lot to prove a point. And I feel like I'm sorry for spending all this time railing at streaming. I know it's very popular. Believe me, I'm aware of it. But the number one thing I hear about streaming is, oh, we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, or we can never, now that it's out there, we can't undo it. And I think the resurgence of vinyl is the perfect example that we can actually have a cultural shift towards not streaming. Streaming is not done very well in Japan. CD is the number one selling format because there's a cultural shift, right? And we stopped using all kinds of products. They've been terrible for the environment and terrible for other reasons. So we stopped using them, even if they're very convenient. So I think the vinyl thing's interesting because it shows that. Sound quality, it really depends where the vinyl's pressed, who's mastering it. There's things that matter way more than simply the format. Vinyl has a slightly wider dynamic range that it can have the wider dynamic range than a CD. But there's also high-res audio, super audio CDs and things like that, Blu-ray audio, DVD audio. There's digital that can have a wider dynamic range. And even this, a lot of this starts in the studio. So a record that's not recorded or mastered, in a certain way, it won't really make a difference. And if you really start to care about audio, which I think is great, I obviously do. I care about like sound. I'm kind of a dork like that. You have to start reading almost like reading the ingredients on food packaging. You have to find out where this record was pressed and who made it, who mastered it. And you start reading things like that. I have like 5 or 6 different versions of certain albums that I bought to compare them, and then I got rid of them and stuff like that. And so it's a whole dorky rabbit trail, but pound for pound, there's no way to really compare CDs to vinyl. And if anyone tells you otherwise, I think they're full of baloney.
Baloney. Yeah, thank you. Listen, this is a really great question we have from Sasha, and we don't have a lot of time, and I hate for you to rush your answers, but this is really good. Last summer, we saw record-breaking protests across the globe. How had protest music found its way back into rock from what you've seen? And do you have any recommendations? And Victoria, she's particularly concerned with your recommendations. So what do you, I did a presentation on this last year, as a matter of fact, like the music's response to George Floyd's murder. Do we see, who were the voices of protest, I guess we should say?
You want me to take this
question
one?
for you? Yeah.
This goes against a little bit the topic of this panel, but I will say the strongest, most poignant protest music at the moment you will see in hip hop. A lot of great Boston hip hop examples, Jay Gatz, Cliff Notes, Oompa, Camp Blood, highly recommend those. I think as a whole, something I've seen in the past couple of years is that across all genres, you do have this almost apocalyptic mindset with regards to politics, the way we interact with each other, our culture. That is more prominent, I would say, in all genres and in rock as a whole. But if you want some really good protest music that is rock, I would recommend Evan Greer. She is from Boston. She just released an album called Spotify is Surveillance. Very interesting stuff, kind of tying in a little bit to what we're talking about here today.
I released her album. Did you know that or not? I couldn't tell if that was a plug.
No, I knew that, but I forgot it until you just mentioned it. I did write about the album, so very familiar.
Yeah, Evan's great, and maybe it's a good segue. Yeah, well, that's a great album. I'm going to hesitate to recommend anything too specific, but what I will recommend, I guess, and I was going to say, I started this label when I was at BU, and so I've been doing it for almost 20 years now. And I've never really not been interested in political music. And I think I've always been interested in political music and only releasing it. But I'll say I've seen artists express their political values in many different ways. Some of them if you listen to the music, there's nothing inherently political, and you get that narrative of why they're playing it and who they are and what they're expressing just by being out there playing their music as their identity. Other times it's very lyrically political. I work with this artist Moore Mother, who's just incredible. Her name is Kamei, and she puts out like 4 records a year across a wide variety of genres. And she put out in 2016 this song called Deadbeat Protest that really felt like it was speaking to a lot of the things happening last year. She's just very ahead of her time. But I would say I only really work with artists that feel like they're really expressing something politically. But there's different ways to express it. It's not always as straightforward as just like lyrics about it.
Michael, do you want to say anything about that?
I have no clue.
Okay.
That's not my expertise.
We probably don't have time for all of the questions. I got questions from Frank and Dan and Thomas over here. Let me read Frank's first. I think the point about rock selling was made by Steinhardt. That's you, Joe. Aren't sales pretty minimal now, though? Are you talking about music streaming as a sale too? Rock isn't really popular on radio anymore, or what's left of the radio. Listening down a lot, I think. And so I think the point was a bit sidestepped. Yeah, that is kind of, we're coming back to where we started. If is there still a rock and roll? Is there still rock? Do we have to? I mean, the genres are so often repeated. The original Billboard album chart names for music were race and hillbilly before Jerry Wexler at Billboard changed them to rhythm and blues and country and western, and yet those still evolve. It does bring up my feeling about it, which I think is less is more in often cases. You know, I think we're probably out of time because we have to make a brief announcement, but I know I'm speaking for everybody here at COM. I want to thank you, Joe and Michael and Victoria, for taking your time to participate in this. You know, if anybody at home has some questions that you'd like to ask this panel, if you want to send them to me through email, I'll be happy to forward them. My email is WM as in moose, CKEEN as in noodle @bu.edu. Thanks again, and I would like to invite you all to participate in the next event that we have. Again, thanks very much to everybody who participated this day on either side. Take care, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.